What is up, guys, and welcome back to Rising Thrills. Today we have another episode of Rising News, and we have a lot of stories to unpack in this one. They're all really tied to each other, in some way. The first is that Travis Kelce has, with his investing firm or whatever he is connected with, has invested $20 million as a majority stakeholder in Six Flags. So I'm not sure what percentage it is now that they will be holding, but it's just an interesting story. This was a couple months ago, of course, but I had never had mentioned anything about it, so I thought I'd just mention it in this video. Something interesting. Will it really affect anything that much? To the average person, you're probably not going to be able to notice anything affected by it, because this happens all the time. Different agencies, different people investing into a company, so it's not really necessarily anything that's going to make a huge difference, but it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. So since have a majority stakeholder, they are a majority shareholder in the company. I believe it's 9% or something like that. They will be on the board of directors. That'll be interesting to see, if there'll be any changes made because of them, which I could see happening because, of course, they will be on the board of directors, so they can make a difference in that way and, change some things that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do. So that's something to keep an eye out, of course, for. I just thought that was interesting. Moving on to the next story. Okay, guys, so the next story I have to cover here is pretty major, and it has to do with acquiring of some of the Six Flags parks. Of course, earlier this year, I guess last year at this point, Six Flags, of course, announced that they were closing Six Flags America, and they did close it. But after that, they did state that they would be closing more parks and looking into that and, maybe going another season before they review it and, decide which parks to close. Because about a week ago, somebody discovered that found filings from the U.S. Trademark and Patent Office for a company called Enchanted Parks, which registered or applied to have different trademarks for different parks. Because basically, whenever somebody acquires a park or buys a park, they have to apply to have that trademark so that they can sell t-shirts, so they can basically have that name. They have to do that whenever they buy a park or acquire a park, basically to have the right to keep that name and be able to sell that name on merchandise and just have that name. So somebody discovered that at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, that this company, Enchanted Parks, applied for multiple parks in the Six Flags chain to basically have the rights to have these names. So what it looks like is basically this chain is going to buy these parks. So the first thing we saw was Water Safari, which I believe the company that owns I believe this Enchanted Parks company already owns and operates this park. So I guess basically that's where they're starting off. So the company that owns this Water Safari Park decided to purchase or acquire some of the Six Flags parks. At first some people were saying, maybe they'll be operating it. Maybe they'll be operating some of the Six Flags parks, which makes no sense because I don't think that would do any good for Six Flags. Why would they want to do that? It makes no sense for Six Flags to do that because they do not gain anything from doing that. If anything, they would lose something because Six Flags is trying to sell the properties in order to make money, of course, the companies that would, if they did sell it, just the operations to a different company and have a different company operate it and them still own, they'd get money from the operator, but it wouldn't make any sense for Six Flags to do it. So what it looks like is Six Flags is selling these parks to Enchanted Parks, which I think is a great thing to see, a smaller company buying a bunch of these Six Flags parks. But now let's get into what parks actually are being sold to this Enchanted Parks chain. So the parks that this chain is supposedly acquiring, first is Schlitterbahn Galveston, which is a water park that Six Flags did own. and still own. So that's the first one that they're supposedly acquiring, or at least they filed for trademarks for Schlitterbahn and Galveston. The next park is Great Escape and the Great Escape Lodge. Another Six Flags. And then we have Michigan's Adventure. I don't know how to feel about Michigan's Adventure, but it's definitely underperforming, and definitely a lot of people would go to Cedar Point instead of Michigan's Adventure. And then we have Worlds of Fun, which is another Cedar Fair park, or Legacy Cedar Fair park. And then we have Six Flags St. Louis. And one thing I wanted to mention with Worlds of Fun was they didn't file for a trademark for Worlds of Fun. They did actually for Oceans of Fun, but it makes no sense for them just to acquire Oceans of Fun when it is literally right next to Worlds of Fun. So most likely they will be acquiring Worlds of Fun as well. I think we will make that assumption just because it makes the most sense. And like I said, Six Flags St. Louis. It's not a ton of parks, but it's definitely, I think for Six Flags, it's probably the right move for them to do, and I do think it is the right move. And there's one major reason why I think it was the right move for them to do this, and that is because most of these parks are underperforming parks. These are parks that do not get much investment at all, and not a lot of visitors. And we saw the whole thing with Six Flags America last year, of course, and of course, I do think that was probably the right thing for them to do, but it was tragic to see them closing down a park, because we don't want to see that we do not want to see that happen again, where they close down a park. It's definitely good to see what just happened, where they just sell it off to another chain, and especially since this is a smaller chain, and it's not something like Hershon, which already has so many parks, and it's like, I do think it is a good thing to have a bunch of smaller chains, for competition, and in the end, as enthusiasts, as the general public, we get more out of it having, multiple smaller chains, because not a ton of people are going to be going to every park. The only advantage to having them all in one chain is being able to get some sort of all-park passport, all-park season pass, but the majority of people aren't doing that, so really, in the end, it is best to have a bunch of smaller chains. So, I do think this move is good by Six Flags. Of course, it is not it hasn't been confirmed by Six Flags. They haven't said anything about this, but we're just assuming that this will be happening, especially since they filed for trademarks, and I'm sure they've been meeting about this for at least a year at this point to discuss what the final decision is. Like I said, I do think this is a good thing what they're doing, because in the end, most of these parks being in the Six Flags chain, they're not going to get much investment at all, because Six Flags at this point is so focused on paying down their debt, which is a good thing, I do think. So in the end, these parks aren't going to be getting these parks are not going to be getting much investment, because, they're going to be focusing on the larger parks in, that perform better, that are in larger metro areas, that would really have a better return on their investment. So these parks that they're selling off wouldn't get as much capital expenditures, wouldn't get as much, just TLC around the parks, upgrades to rides, new restaurants, or even upgrades to paths and stuff like that. So really, in the end, I do think this is better, because if what I'm assuming is correct, is I would think that this new chain would end up putting more into these parks, because they don't have so many parks to worry about. They'll just have 4 dry parks and, maybe about 4 or 5 water parks, which I do think it's great, and I'm really excited to see what happens with this. And I do think what they did is great, Going over the parks again, Great Escape, of course. Six Flags did just, 2 years ago or so at this point, they did just add their new Gravity Group wooden coaster. So, that is something like, they just added that, but of course, we can't predict what happened, especially with this whole mergers and such. It was really hard to predict what would happen next. So, I'm sure, I'm sure they're not happy about it, but at the same point, it's not a big deal. It's a small wooden coaster, wasn't a ton of money, and I do think it's good to see this park joining that chain, especially since it's in New York, and I believe the water safari that this chain already owns is up in New York as well, so it would be a good pair of the two parks. Michigan's Adventure, of course, this park does not get much attendance, it doesn't get much investment at all, so I do think this is great to see this happen. Six Flags St. Louis, of course, you know, same as all these other parks, it doesn't get much investment, and I do think this will be better off. Now, of course, with Six Flags St. Louis, one thing that they'll have to think about is all of the IP rides, such as, you know, the DC rides with this park, especially with all the DC rides, because most of the other parks that they're acquiring don't have DC or even any sorts of rides with IPs. But Mr. Freeze Reverse Blast, and I believe they have a Batman clone as well, and some other DC rides. So they'll have to retheme these rides. You know, that'll take a good amount of effort. But, you know, overall, it's not a big deal. It's not too hard to retheme a ride. You know, you don't even really have to repaint it. You just have to take down the sign and replace it with a new sign. That's all they really had to do. And then Worlds of Fun. I haven't been to Worlds of Fun, but it is one of the legacy Cedar Fair parks. And it really does look like a phenomenal park with, I believe it's like 7 different countries or continents. I'm not quite sure on that, but looks like a great park. Now, they, of course, as Great Escape they did recently get Zambezi Zinger, which is their wooden coaster from GCI, which replaced the old Zambezi Zinger, which was a Schwarzkopf, you know, spiral tower coaster. So, you know, it looks like a great park, and I as much as I would like it to remain in the Six Flags chain, you know, it is a great park, and I do think it is good that they're joining this chain because, you know, it gives this chain more diversity and, you know, a great park lineup. So it is great. So that's all the parks. And, of course, there is Schlitterbahn, which is a water park. I don't know too much about it, but overall, I do think in the end this is a good decision that they made. If this is 100% true, of course, we just have filings through the Patent Office, Trademark and Patent Office. So this isn't confirmed by either parties, but most likely this will happen, and I do think it's good. But that's all the news stories I have for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.